So one of the common threads for a lot of the questions on Churchland and Churchland was sort of about the systems reply or the brain simulator reply or both. So if we look back at Searle for a moment, he's got among the replies he replies to, he's got this thing he calls the systems reply and this thing he calls the brain simulator reply. So the systems reply is, oh, well, the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but the whole system together understands Chinese. So the person plus the room plus the rulebooks, that's like a system for understanding Chinese. And so together they understand Chinese. Or the brain simulator reply is, look, to understand Chinese or something like this, you need to do more than just have like a crude rulebook for translating Chinese. You need to have basically something simulating what the brain is doing, which is much more complicated. But as long as you simulate that, as long as the person is simulating that, then we have sort of understanding of Chinese there. And Searle's response to both of these, he's got one response which is basically the same, which is, look, for the systems reply, imagine you sort of memorize or internalize, as he puts it, all the elements of the system. So you memorize the rules and all these things. So now instead of being in a room and you get a piece of Chinese paper in and you look at the rule book and you write Chinese symbols and you put them out, now in your head you have the rule book and all the symbols. And so somebody hands you a piece of paper with Chinese written on it. You read it, you think about the symbols in your head, you think about the rule book, you write the answer, and now you can sort of write Chinese without understanding it, he says. And similarly in the brain simulator reply, you're inside the Chinese room sort of simulating a brain with all these levers or whatever. Just take that simulation and memorize how it works, all the rules about how the levers connect, put that in your brain, and now again you can do the Chinese stuff but without understanding it. So that's Searle's reply to this sort of thing. And Churchland effectively have to deny this, and a lot of you pointed this out in your questions. So if we look at some of the questions, so we have this. There's this research on building artificial cochlea and retina, but isn't this similar to the simulator reply where you're sort of building the wrong thing, or you're not, you won't get understanding out of this thing you build, or you're sort of simulating how the brain works, but then isn't this simulating the wrong thing about the brain? Don't you have to simulate the sort of actual neurological functions of the brain, in which case you're just building another brain? Or this question, you know, the brain simulator, don't you have to simulate the neurophysiology, not just the functions of the brain? Or this, if you have a systems argument, like all the parts of the system still don't understand anything, so what are you talking about? The whole system together can understand things. And then, so the initial point is, yes, in a way, the Churchlands and most of the opponents of Searle pretty much accept something like the systems reply, or maybe the brain simulator reply. The Churchland and Churchland seems to go for both. When they talk about all that parallel computing stuff, the idea seems to be trying to copy the way the brain kind of functions. Either way, it seems like they accept the systems reply, which is, you know, once you have all this stuff doing these tasks, then you get consciousness. And so you might think, well, look, they haven't responded to Searle's point. And I think to understand what's going on here, to understand how somebody might respond to Searle, it helps to look at his sort of second reply to the systems reply, or his second point about the systems reply. So the first point is, look, memorize all the systems, stick them in your brain, you still won't understand. His second point is, look, actually, I feel somewhat embarrassed to give even this answer to the systems theory, because the theory seems to me so implausible to start with. The idea that while a person doesn't understand Chinese, somehow the conjunction of that person and bits of paper might understand Chinese. It's not easy for me to imagine how someone who is not in the grip of an ideology would find the idea at all plausible. But the idea is, it's just, you just have to be crazy to think that, oh, sorry, I've covered up the PDF. You just have to be crazy to think that, you know, a person in conjunction with a room and bits of paper and a rule book could understand Chinese. And so here's a reason that the Churchlands and lots of philosophers might not be very convinced by Searle's sort of two replies to the systems argument. So let's start with this second reply, which is, you just have to be crazy to think a person in conjunction with stuff understands anything. So first, it sort of helps to realize that on Searle's view, it's a little unclear exactly who understands things. Is it the brain that understands things, or is it you that understands things, or are they things together? I think we are sort of systems in a way. Searle sometimes makes it seem like we're brains, but really we're brains hooked up to eyes and ears and things. If you don't have ears, you can't sort of understand spoken speech, or you need eyes to read somebody's lips, or you need eyes to read the paper, something like that. And so you might think, well, even with humans, there's sort of a system going on. It's not the brain alone. It's the brain plus the eyes, or the brain plus the ears, or maybe it's the person who understands, not the brain. So it's not crazy to think that like systems understand. How about systems that aren't entirely biological, systems that include like a piece of paper or something? Well, I often understand things with non-biological things. So if I'm doing a math problem, I often find it helpful to write things out on a piece of paper. And sort of before I write it out on a piece of paper, I don't understand it. When I write it out on a piece of paper, I do understand it. So my understanding seems to consist of me plus the piece of paper. Take away the paper, no more understanding. Put the paper back, understanding. So maybe in conjunction with something, I understand something. Or maybe I have a little translator device on my lapel, and that translates languages I don't understand into something else. Do I understand alone, or do I understand in conjunction with the translator? I don't know. You could potentially think that the translator is part of me when it comes to understanding. So that's one direction you could go. But the sort of stronger point, which doesn't require all this system stuff, is look at his first reply to the system's reply. So he says, look, memorize the system and you still won't understand Chinese. But I mean, think about what it would be like if you memorize this system, if you really memorize the rules in the Chinese room. Somebody would hand you a piece of paper in Chinese. You would look at the piece of paper. You would have something going on inside your head that would allow you to write out the correct answers to this piece of paper. So it's asking a question and you write the right answers, or whatever it is, you can write out the correct answers. What is going on in your head when you're doing it? Well, you're following a set of rules. They're very, very complicated rules. So there's no way this experiment could ever work in real life, because of course you can never write a book with rules to speak Chinese. It's just any language is too complicated. But just imagine it could work. They're very complicated rules, and you know how all the rules work. You know how all the symbols line up. Now Searle says, look, you still don't understand what the rules are about. You still don't understand Chinese. But I mean, think about how it works when you read something in English or in another language that you understand. So just look at these words on this page. My response to the systems theory is quite simple. Let the individual internalize all the elements of the system. So you understand that sentence, you just read it, and then you understood it. What rule did you follow to get from reading the sentence, reading the words, or even the individual letters on the page? How did you go from that to understanding? What rules did you follow? Do you understand those rules? No, they're sort of completely opaque to you. If you think really hard about it, you can come up with the grammar rules. So you can sort of explain how the verb works and how the nouns work and stuff, and the subject and the object of the sentence. And then if you get very, very complicated and you study a lot of linguistics, you can start to diagram the whole sentence and explain how you understand it and things like this. But we still don't sort of fully understand how language understanding works. And so the idea is, in your head, you have rules for turning language into other things, so language into information or language into other language or things. But you don't sort of know how those rules work. You don't have sort of full understanding of those rules. And so the thought is, what you're doing when you sort of read something in English and write something in English, or read something in any language and write something in any language, there's nothing like extra there. There's nothing sort of extra understanding beyond just being able to take in and put out, or in this case, take in this sort of thing and then put out eventually the correct response when I ask you what Searle thinks or something like that. So the thought is, what is the extra special stuff that's apparently supposed to be going on in your head that the Chinese room person doesn't have? There's no room for it. Like, what would that be? What's it supposed to feel like? What's the different feeling that you get when you read English compared to what the Chinese room memorizer gets when he reads Chinese? And the thought is there's nothing extra there. And that's what the Churchlands would say, and that's what a lot of philosophers say to Searle, which is that on the surface you tell the story and oh, of course he memorizes it and he doesn't know Chinese because they're still not understanding. But how could you ever memorize it and not end up knowing Chinese? You can look at any Chinese symbol and put out any other Chinese symbol, and that's just what Chinese people can do when they read and write Chinese. That's what English speakers can do when they read and write English. So what else, what extra is missing? Understanding? Like, what even is that? So that's the thought, and that's the reply that the Churchlands would give. Is it effective? I don't know, it's up to you to decide, but the thought is that, well, what exactly is this special sauce that I'm missing? It's very hard to actually explain, and if you can't explain it, then maybe it sort of doesn't exist, and Searle is wrong to say sort of this extra special thing.